So this lunchtime, I'm going to be talking to you about the birthplace of marine science in Southern California. And yes, big surprise, it actually was Los Angeles Harbor. For over a century, Los Angeles Harbor has been at the forefront of scientific discovery and technological advancement. So let me just preface that by saying scientific research in California is older than California is a state. And the California Academy of Sciences was created in 1853, just shortly after California became a state. And there were a lot of scientific surveys of the West, mostly with scientists from the East Coast universities. And many early scientists that were stationed in California were in the Bay Area. They were associated with Stanford or Berkeley. They were not in Southern California. So what actually was going on in marine science in the 19th century? Well, like many scientific fields, scientific exploration was often the pastime of the wealthy. And to some degree, that holds true for marine science. There were basically three types of marine research stations in the world in the late 19th century. There were international stations like the Naples Zoological Station in Italy. There were summer field stations that eventually developed into permanent laboratories like the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole. And there were outposts of universities like Stanford's Hopkins Marine Laboratory. That was in Pacific Grove on Monterey Bay in Northern California. And that was actually the first marine station on the US West Coast. So now I need to introduce you to two men who had very different views of what Los Angeles Harbor would become. On the left, we have Professor William E. Ritter. He began teaching biology in Berkeley in 1891. And in the summer of 1892, he set up a tent laboratory, a laboratory in a tent at Pacific Grove on Monterey Bay. But Stanford was already there, and academics tend to be very competitive. So Ritter turned his view to Southern California. First, he set up a tent laboratory in Avalon on Catalina Island, and traveling back and forth to Catalina Island familiarized himself with the LA Harbor, and so he set his sights on LA Harbor for a marine station. At the same time, we have the man on the right, Thomas E. Gibbons, an attorney working for the Terminal Railway Company, and he set his sights on the development of Los Angeles Harbor for commerce. Gibbon would later go on to become one of the first Port of Los Angeles Harbor Commissioners in 1907. Now, I have direct evidence that these two men knew each other because Gibbon sent a letter to Harrison Gray Otis of the Los Angeles Times in 1902 introducing Ritter. Though not intentionally, these two men were working at cross purposes when it came to the future of Los Angeles Harbor. So when both these men came to the harbor, it looked a little bit like this. This slide shows the first federal civil works project in the harbor. The Army Corps of Engineers built a breakwater in 1871 that went from DEADMAN'S Island to the tip of Rattlesnake Island, which is Terminal Island today. And that was to protect the harbor area back in Wilmington. And oh, the Army Corps of Engineers had a heck of a time getting this breakwater to stay in place. So there was actually a part of the breakwater that they called the DOUBLEWORKS. And they basically, it was pretty much wood bulkheads, and they filled in between the two wood bulkheads with stones and soil, and then they planted trees on it, trying to help maintain a breakwater that would weather the winter storms. And the Corps actually assumed, well, sand would accrete along this breakwater and hold it in place. Well, that didn't actually work. And so then they started making these little groins to try and capture sand to build up along this breakwater to protect the channel into the inner harbor. Unwittingly, they were creating waterfront property. And so as sand accreted along both sides of the breakwater, people began moving onto the breakwater and living there. First, you had hermits and fishermen, people down on their luck. They lived in shacks, mostly made of driftwood. They were squatters. They didn't own the land. They scavenged for building materials. And oh, happy day when a lumber barge dumped its load in the harbor and the planks all floated to shore. But over time, an entire community developed along that breakwater. It was known as East San Pedro. It was on Terminal Island, though. It wasn't on the mainland side where San Pedro is today. And there were homes, there were businesses, and there were bathhouses for tourists. Well, one of those bathhouses caught Ritter's eye, and he convinced the owner to allow him to convert it into a laboratory. So like the Hopkins Marine Station, this marine station was an outpost of a university, and it was well received in Los Angeles because at that time we had nothing in Southern California connected to the University of California. The Los Angeles Normal School eventually became the southern branch of the University of California and became UCLA, but that didn't happen until 1919. So this lab opened in 1901, and as you can see, it was a long white structure facing the harbor's main channel. The old bathhouse was fitted with 6 little private rooms for the use of the scientists, and the last room was converted to a library. And during the day, the students would work in the lab or collect samples, and then they'd held lecture in the evenings. And I have to say, eminent scientists from Harvard, from the Smithsonian, traveled to California to visit this lab and to give lectures. So Ritter also leased one of the ferry boats that was used to ferry passengers from San Pedro over to Terminal Island to East San Pedro and converted into a research vessel. It was called the Elsie, and here's a picture of it in the harbor. So this is the only picture I've been able to get inside the laboratory. And this is actually, it's not a great picture. It's actually taken from the Herald Examiner in 1901. And the caption on this photograph was classifying sea things. But the remarkable thing about this photo is, look, there are women in this laboratory. Yes, this was not only a research laboratory, but a teaching laboratory. And one of its purposes was to teach teachers marine science. So there were women students, and there were also women researchers that were associated with this laboratory. So I don't have enough time to go into all of the significant discoveries that were made at this particular laboratory. But according to Professor Ritter, the first documented red tide was made by investigators that were stationed at this laboratory. And it extended all the way from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. And those of you that, familiar with the ocean, in certain times of year, the water looks red because of the one-celled organism that is overpopulated. As I said, there were women scientists working out of the lab. 2 of them were Sarah Monks and M. Burton Williamson. And both of these women were engaged in scientific study of the harbor before Ritter even showed up on the scene. They each had their own squatter shack in East San Pedro where they were conducting their scientific research. And Monks would be credited with the discovery of the regeneration of starfish limbs. M. Burton Williamson would identify many new species, and her collection was the first at the Los Angeles Natural History Museum. If you go to down to Los Angeles Natural History Museum, you say, I want to see specimen number 1 of your collection, like 00001. Well, what they'll tell you to do is, well, you got to drive to Carson to a big warehouse there, and they'll bring out a shell for you. And they did this for me, and it was a shell collected by M. Burton Williamson. This is M. Burton Williamson's publication on the mollusks of San Pedro Bay. I have not been able to find any published work by an individual scientist on bay biology that's earlier than this. This was published by the Smithsonian in 1882. And I think, how cool is it that a woman did our first paper from the harbor? People thought she was trying to disguise her sex, but she really wasn't. I went to the Smithsonian Archives in Washington, D.C. to view all of her correspondence, and she corresponded with scientists around the world, and they were very, they knew that she was a female. So one of the reasons scientists were drawn to Los Angeles Harbor was because of its paleontological resources, and this particular location known as Dead Man's Island. It was a fossil collector's dream site because layers of geological history were exposed. And if you look at many early publications on paleontological resources in Southern California, you'll always see Dead Man's Island listed as a collecting site. So in Ritter's diary, I read his diaries in 1901, he considered actually moving the laboratory from Terminal Island over to Dead Man's Island. He took many excursions out there with another eminent scientist that was part of the lab, Charles Cousteau. They were good friends. They were both educated at Harvard, and Cousteau also came out to Dead Man's Island. In the 1860s, Dead Man's Island was a whaling station. And of course, it's called Dead Man's Island because it's a burial ground. But it was blown up in 1920 when the Los Angeles Harbor Department widened the channel. And actually, the rock that was part of Dead Man's Island was also used to construct part of the harbor, an area where the Coast Guard station is today. But if you go to that Carson warehouse, there's a big, huge slab of Dead Man's Island there. So you can't run a marine station without money. And so from the very beginning, Ritter focused on fundraising for the laboratory. He often traveled to Los Angeles to meet with people about donations. That's why he got Gibbon to introduce him to the man running the LA Times. At the end of 2 years, he realized at a minimum he needed $25,000 for a new building and equipping a lab, and another $10,000 for a research vessel, and another $5,000 for operating expenses. So heroic efforts were made to raise funds, but it was not enough. And so those of you who may know a little bit about LA history or LA, look at Mr. Van Nuys, Henry O'Melveny. These were all the big movers and shakers in LA at that time. They were donors to the lab. Meanwhile, Thomas E. Gibbon and others were hard at work making sure that San Pedro Bay was the place the federal government invested its money to build a deep water port, including funding of the first major breakwater. Here's the first one from Dead Man's Island to, you know, the lab was over here to Terminal Island, and then that was the 1871 breakwater, and then the major breakwater called the San Pedro Bay breakwater. So, and it was really again to protect the outer harbor from the heavy surf. So this breakwater and what it meant for the future of Los Angeles Harbor was not lost on Ritter. He was there operating a lab while all this construction activity was going on. And Ritter began to fear that the future of the port might be more industrial. So when Cousteau took the Elsie research vessel down to San Diego to collect, he met a bunch of people down there who began to lobby strongly for the lab to be moved south. So in 1903, the lab was here in 1901, 1902, and then 1903 it disappeared, and then it popped up on Coronado Island in 1903. And he had a couple of students in the early classes down there whose last name was Scripps. And you know, you can imagine what happened there. Fundraising was a lot easier in San Diego, and the laboratory that Ritter started ultimately became the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Ritter became the first director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Cousteau became the first assistant director. So when I found out we lost our laboratory to San Diego, I reached out to Scripps, the archivist, and I said, gee, I'd like to see what information you have on the lab when it was in, you know, in Terminal Island in LA Harbor. Do you have any photos or anything? And the guy's like, what are you talking about? The lab was never in Los Angeles Harbor. I said, oh yeah, the lab was in Los Angeles Harbor. So I thought, oh, I'm never going to hear from this guy again. And then the next week, a whole bunch of emails started coming into my email like, oh my God, I found the lab. And so the pictures that I have of the LC in the laboratory came from the Scripps archive, and the archivist there was not even aware until I asked him the question that the laboratory started out in Los Angeles Harbor. So a kindred spirit to Thomas E. Gibbon was a man named Captain Amos Fries of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He was brought in to oversee this big breakwater construction, and he arrived in Los Angeles straight from the Philippines, where he was really indoctrinated by an American expansionist view of the Pacific, and he believed that the Pacific was Los Angeles Harbor's future. Now, coupled with the technological advances in dredging equipment, Fries knew that man could now mold the harbors as they wanted them. Dredges have been around for centuries, but now they had a cutter suction dredge. Engineers could quickly drain wetlands, suck up the muck from the harbor bottoms to make a harbor channel and pump it to wherever they wanted to make new land. So naturally, Gibbon and Fries got along really well. The Fries plan for harbor configuration of the channels, which are all these dotted lines here in this schematic, are pretty much the harbor that we have today. And Gibbon was bound and determined, once Fries set up all these harbor lines, to make sure that the harbor was prepared for the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. So you can see the dotted lines for these two piers here. He wanted to concentrate on development in the outer harbor. This pier was known as the Minor Concession. This pier was known as the Huntington Concession after Henry Huntington. It later became known as City Dock Number 1. And here's City Dock Number 1 under construction. As you see, this pier is being constructed of concrete. Back in 1913, using concrete was a radical departure from the way engineers were building piers. The harbor department at that time did not have its own engineer. It relied on the city engineer, who was concerned about seawater's impact on cement. So Gibbon, on the other hand, was like, hey, we're going to start moving oil out of this port. We got to be worried about fire. We want to build the piers of concrete. And so there was a big battle between Public Works and between the city engineer. And 1913 in Los Angeles history is sometimes called the year of civil war in the city of Los Angeles, as the internal city family fought over this. The entire Harbor Commission, including Gibbon, resigned, but in the end, the pier was constructed with concrete. And good thing, you know, the pier is still standing. But the civil war between the city departments delayed the project, and the pier was not open at the time that the Panama Canal opened in 1914. It was delayed. So the port was growing. The entire community of East San Pedro living on the breakwater would be evicted in 1912 to make way for widening the harbor's main channel because ships were getting bigger. And this actually is an eviction notice that went to Charles Loomis, a founder of the Southwest Museum. He was actually a squatter on the breakwater. DEADMAN'S Island would also be blasted out of the way to widen the channel for bigger ships. So Ritter's prediction came through. The tiny laboratories in the shacks on East San Pedro were gone. The fossil hunters lost one of their great best collecting sites. So even though Ritter's prediction about an industrial harbor came to pass, you know, by the 1920s, you know, that happened. And by the 1920s, you find complaints about harbor pollution. But scientific research still went on because even polluted waters was a cause for scientific examination. So in the 1920s, Los Angeles spewed its sewage into Santa Monica Bay from a trestle only 2,000 feet from the shore. This was before the pioneering studies of underwater submarine sewage diffusion through pipelines. And that research was done by Dr. D.H. Palmer. And where did he do his research? In LA Harbor. This is a picture of him on a barge in LA Harbor in 1925. Also in the 1920s, Los Angeles became the home port for ships owned by G. Allan Hancock. He was the owner of the Rancho La Brea Oil Company, and he was the man who donated the La Brea tar pits to the County of Los Angeles. So remember I told you scientific exploration was often something done by the wealthy. These were private oceanographic research vessels that were built by wealthy men, but they would invite prominent scientists from academic institutions to sail with them. So the boat in front is the VELERO 2. That's a small one. That was built in 1922, and it sailed down to Mexican waters. And those of you that may know a little bit of harbor history may have heard the name Banning, Phineas Banning. You know, his grandson, George Hugh Banning, sailed on one of those scientific expeditions, and he wrote a book called In Mexican Waters that you can still find in the libraries about the scientific exploration on the VELERO 2. Now, this in the back is the VELERO 3. That was launched in 1931. This ship was built as a floating laboratory and was large enough to sail to the South Pacific. So G. Allan Hancock already had a number of expeditions under his belt when USC announced the creation of the Allan Hancock Foundation in 1938. And the next day, he left on an expedition, setting sail 10,000 miles. You know, this is a photograph that was taken of that announcement, and the next day they left for the South Pacific. I actually found this photograph, the original photograph, on eBay. So here's Allan Hancock. This man here is USC professor John Garth. And when I first came to USC, he was a little old man. And I remember taking a class from him on Captain Cook's expeditions. If only I knew then as a student what I know now about Dr. John Garth, I wish I had some great conversations with him. But I do remember him saying, you could not sail on a scientific expedition out of, you know, LA Harbor on this vessel unless you played an instrument, because they had a music salon on the ship. And so you do science all day, and then in the evening you retreated and made music. Now, if you want to learn more about John Garth and a really interesting expedition of this vessel, go online and watch the movie The Galapagos Affair. Satan Comes to Eden. It's a murder mystery. It was a movie. You can find it on Amazon Prime. It came out in 2013, and it's about a murder mystery that this vessel gets involved. It's a true story. And John Garth figures prominently in that story. And so I learned more about him, you know, after he was gone, unfortunately. But anyhow, the movies, The Galapagos Affair, Satan Comes to Eden. So, you know, Captain Hancock actually gave the VELERO 3 to USC. He donated it to USC. But he was not done with sea voyages after he let go of the VELERO 3. Because in 1947, the VELERO 4 was launched. And that was actually the ship that I sailed on when I was at USC. So here's the VELERO 4. Here's Captain Allan Hancock, a little bit older now. Here's the Palos Verdes Hills. They are now testing an innovation in diving in LA Harbor, and it was called the AQUA-LUNG. And so the man they are suiting up is a young French naval officer named Jacques Cousteau. Los Angeles Harbor was at the forefront in innovations in diving and underwater construction. The technology for underwater construction may have been developed elsewhere, but huge projects laying undersea pipeline for the Hyperion sewage treatment plant and for the Edison power plant outfalls led to many refinements in the techniques of underwater construction. In fact, the first ever civilian diving school in the United States was started in Los Angeles Harbor. It was called Sparling School of Diving. It was located in Wilmington, berth 179, and opened right after World War II. So this photo was from 1947. And yes, the Navy taught men how to dive and do hard hat diving. And then when a lot of them left the Navy, they would become commercial divers. But this was the first commercial school in the United States, possibly even in the world, for commercial divers. After that school, we had the School of Oceaneering, opened in 1967. And a famous female oceanographer, Sylvia Earle, came here to test the atmospheric diving suit, Jim. Those are those big white things that is like a one-man submarine. And the diving school ultimately moved to a barge, and I believe in 2010 it went down to San Diego. Or it moved to a barge in 2010 and then went down to San Diego. So complaints about pollution in the harbor is as old as the harbor itself. First it was sewage, then it was oil spills. Industries were discharging chemical waste into the channels that led in the harbor, not only down the LA River, but the channel called the Dominguez Channel. And this map from 1954 shows how polluted the harbor was. The shaded areas are basically all of the polluted areas. And so scientists from LA Harbor would go out to measure the oxygen in the water. And they would be, I mean, most of the harbor was dead. There was nothing living in the harbor. So this was all from pollution. Here you had an active naval base in World War II, and all those guys on the ship, when they were scraping down the ship and paint, they threw everything over the side. So this also was a very polluted area. And so pollution put Los Angeles Harbor on the map for several reasons. First, the research that tied pollution to specific species. In this case, it were worms that became known as indicator species. And indicator species are the ones whose presence can be indicators of environmental conditions. And the man who did much of this early research is Dr. Donald REISH from Cal State University, Long Beach. He's an emeritus professor there now. In addition to pollution, he studied the wood-boring isopods, the crustaceans that get into the pilings and gnaw on them, eat them. He did his PhD thesis on that at USC in 1950. 63 years later, in 2013, the Port of Los Angeles funded Dr. REISH to return to the harbor and repeat his study at the same locations he did in 1950. That just goes to show you many of those early channel configurations never changed after Captain Amos Freeze of the Army Corps set those channels. Not surprisingly, in 2013, he found that the he didn't find many wood borers because most of the harbor had been converted to concrete pilings. He found wood borers way up in the consolidated slip. He also found the oxygen level up there in 2013 was 6.7 parts per million, and in 1950 it was 0.1 part per million. Just shows you how the conditions had changed over time. Another pollution story put Los Angeles Harbor map. In 1946, the Port of Los Angeles had the highest tuna production volume in the world. During the peak of operations, 80% of the tuna being canned was coming out of LA Harbor. It was so important to us that on the seal of the County of Los Angeles, we have a tuna fish because it was such an important industry. So this is the 1952 Starcrest opened the world's largest tuna cannery in the harbor. The building was designed by a prominent architect and designer. He went on to do the Space Needle up in Seattle. But the canneries dumped their fish waste directly into the harbor. And the issue of discharge of waste through a diffusion system would raise its ugly head again, okay? And the hypothesis was that, oh, but fish waste is organic material. And so if we diffuse the waste over a large enough area, it's going to be okay because all the fish are going to like to eat that and stuff. And so many studies were done, and it drew those conclusions. And this was a very controversial finding. It was called bioenhancement of the marine environment with fish waste. The research was conducted by the Harbor's Environmental Project out of USC, led by Dorothy Sewell. This is a picture of her and her husband. They both had offices up at USC. But it was extremely controversial, these reports, because of the fact that the canneries funded the research. Now, despite the controversy about the fish cannery studies, and Dorothy Sewell and her husband would make their mark on harbor research by conducting a whole series of investigation called the Marine Studies of San Pedro Bay. If you had every volume, it'd take up a giant shelf on your library. They also did other applied research studies for oil companies, such as the impact of the oil spill associated with the Sansanina tanker explosion in Los Angeles Harbor in 1976. This was actually one of my first diving assignments when I first went to work for the Port of Los Angeles. Here's a copy of one of the volumes of the Marine Environment, and Dorothy and her husband, of course, were co-authors of this study. So now I've painted a very gloomy picture of LA Harbor, polluted, fish waste, stuff coming down the Dominguez Channel, oil and all this other stuff. And so, gosh, how did we get such a remarkable turnaround in harbor waters and marine life in the harbor? Well, we owe it all to a Beverly Hills housewife named Helen Stern Harris. She was appointed to the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board in 1970. She came down to the harbor, she saw its condition, and she made her mark by pressing on controls for discharges coming down the Dominguez Channel that flowed into Los Angeles Harbor. And even Professor Emeritus Dr. Donald Rice credits Helen Stern Harris for starting the big turnaround in Los Angeles Harbor waters. And I remember there was a big, I think she died about 5 years ago, a big story about her. Not trained as a scientist or anything, but saw an environmental problem and was very vocal. She then became a very activist in the early environmental movement in Los Angeles Harbor. So the improvements in water quality were dramatic. In 1988, the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles began doing investigation of the biota in the harbors every 5 years or so. And those early studies show a continuous improvement in species diversity. In 2013, we can see the kelp that actually, I actually was involved in transplanting some of that from Catalina to the harbor in the late 1970s, and how much the kelp canopy has grown in Los Angeles Harbor. So over the course of, LA Harbor's history, it continues to draw many scientists, and it still does today. In the late 1970s, USC began an effort to build a laboratory at Los Angeles Harbor. It's on Terminal Island in Fish Harbor. It's kind of tucked away, kind of hard to find. And researchers have worked, before that, they were working out of an old transit shed in Wilmington. And so in the early 80s, they moved into this harbor. At the same time, the researchers from Cal State Long Beach had their own consortium. And then they decided in the economic downturn of the early 1990s to come together and form a consortium. And it's called Southern California Marine Institute. And today there's over 23 colleges and foundations that are members of this consortium. They are essentially out of space. They don't have a lot of space there at LA Harbor. And so in November 2013, the Port of Los Angeles entered into a 50-year lease with ALTASEA, a nonprofit that was leased a 30-acre area of the original city dock #1, the one that Gibbon resigned over because they wanted to build it out of wood instead of concrete. Thank God it's still there. And this is a campus that is devoted to marine-related and maritime-related research, education, and business entrepreneurialism. So it is continuing the chapter in the history of marine research in LA Harbor. I should say that ALTASEA is now the winter home of Dr. Robert Ballard, Bob Ballard. He was the discoverer of the Titanic. He's based out of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in the summer. Now he's based out of LA Harbor in the winter. So very often he is in port. There's many open houses to go down there. You can go on and look up the ALTASEA's website and look at all the open houses that they have down there and a lot of the programs that are going on down there. I should actually mention that October 10th, there's a drive-in experience in the parking lot of the USS Iowa down at Los Angeles Harbor. It's the first ever hydrogen-powered event. And you can come in. Bob Ballard's going to be there. He's getting an award. It's going to be the U.S. Premiere of an ocean-related opera. The actress Helen is opening the event, so you can go on ALTASEA's website if you want to go buy a ticket to this drive-in experience down there on Saturday, October 10th. So if you want to find out more about Los Angeles Harbor, I published a book, Port of Los Angeles. You can find that on Amazon. If you want to find out more about the women scientists and the first laboratory that became Scripps and Dr. William E. Ritter, I published a couple papers in Southern California Academy of Sciences, specifically about those women and about that early laboratory.